Good afternoon. Now we will talk about Patriarch Tikhon, his life, feats, and contemporary veneration.
He became the Primate of the Russian Church in 1917, in the hour of God's wrath, in days of much sorrow and much hardship. This is how the newly elected Patriarch assessed that time himself. Ascending the throne, restored after a 2-century hiatus, Saint Tikhon called on people to show spirit and strength, inspiration and loyalty, and to fearlessly confess the faith in every word and deed. These were undoubtedly his personal principles, by which he had lived over the preceding years, and which naturally remained with him throughout all the years of his service as Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia. A very interesting situation developed in the Russian Empire at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Outwardly, everything seemed ideal. Harvests were growing, factories were opening, high society was shining. It was this situation that would later be called revolutionary, due to the many contradictions in society, and the Orthodox Church, as an integral part of society, was no exception.
The head of the church was the emperor, but the church was led by an official who was called the chief prosecutor of the Holy Governing Synod. These chief prosecutors were not always even Orthodox people. For example, Prince Golitsyn, appointed to the post of chief prosecutor of the Holy Governing Synod at the beginning of the 19th century, came to Tsar Alexander I and said, "Sir, why did you appoint me to this position? Firstly, I am a Mason, and secondly, an atheist." The emperor told him, "Go ahead, you will manage." Can you imagine it?
The Patriarchate of Moscow was abolished by Tsar Peter I. More than a century and a half passed from that moment until the birth of the future Saint Tikhon. Only historians and theologians remembered that the Russian Church had once been headed by a patriarch.
It says here that Patriarch Tikhon was born in the district of Toropets. That is correct, but there is one small clarification. He was born in a tiny village called Klin.
Klin is in the region of Pskov. There is no village anymore, only a cemetery and a church where the father of the future patriarch served as a priest, and where he was baptized in the name of Saint Basil the Great.
Крещается раб Божий Василий во имя Отца Аминь, и Сына Аминь, и Святаго Духа Аминь.
This is the clerical register of the town of Toropets and its district, listing the clergy and church servants. It mentions the father of Bishop Tikhon, Ion Timofeyev Belavin, and that he had 3 children. Vasily was the youngest, and according to this register, he was 1 year old.
Please note that the Belavin's family name is written with a double L. It was like that in every document before the Russian Revolution. When Vasily was 4, his father moved to the town of Toropets. This is in the region of Tver now. The family tomb miraculously survived. A chapel over it was built in our time.
Patriarch Tikhon is love. A man who loves other people always goes out of his way to help everyone. Got it, children?
Priest George, who is also the father of the future patriarch, serves as rector of the Transfiguration Church in Toropets.
To serve in the Church of the Transfiguration of the Lord is, of course, an honor, and I consider it very joyful.
Toropets was a pilgrimage center even in the 19th century. Russian Prince Alexander Nevsky was married here, and in memory of this, his young wife presented the townspeople with the miraculous Kursun, icon of the Mother of God. The town had a monastery, more than 20 churches, and a theological school, which Vasily entered when he was only 9.
Patriarch Tikhon studied in another building. That was a wooden one, and this school was built in 1900. His brother Mikhail died in 1902, and in 1904, Bishop Tikhon wrote a letter to the town of Toropets and asked to organize a church in the theological school and consecrate it in honor of Mikhail, the first metropolitan of Kiev. The clergy gave their approval, and Bishop Tikhon sent his own money to establish a church within the walls of the theological school.
At the age of 13, graduate of the Toropets Theological School, Vasily Belavin, entered the Pskov seminary quite easily. His elder brother and father had previously studied there.
This is an entry from the library showing which books Vasily Belavin borrowed. They include The Russian Herald, Afanasyev's Fairy Tales, and Son of the Fatherland.
The future patriarch was an excellent student, and already at a young age he devoted much time to prayer. He attended services not only in the seminary church, but also in the ancient cathedrals and monasteries of Pskov. It's very interesting that Vasily's nickname, which other seminarians gave him, was Bishop.
He had a very gentle, kind disposition. Despite his rather impressive size, he was tall, a handsome young man, but at the same time he treated everyone with love. And when he was recommended for admission to the St. Petersburg Theological Academy after completing his studies in 1884, he went as the best student. By the 1880s, the number of people wishing to study within these walls had increased approximately threefold since the 1870s. About 360 people were admitted, but only 120 had the opportunity to study for free. Vasily Ivanovich Belavin had a good preparation at the Pskov Theological Seminary, since he was entering for a free place. The course was very intelligent. In February 1889, when the Academy gathered for the Assembly Day, and the report dedicated to the graduation of 1888, it was said that the graduation of that year was one of the strongest in the entire history of the St. Petersburg Theological Schools.
When the future patriarch studied at the Theological Academy, the rector was the future metropolitan of St. Petersburg, Anthony, and the inspector was the future bishop of Taurida, Mikhail. 3 years ahead of him was Alexei Khrapovitsky, the future archbishop of Kharkov, and also a candidate for the patriarchal throne. And among his classmates was the future Georgian exarch Tikhon. The first obedience of the student Belavin at the Theological Academy was assistant librarian. His first practice was lecturing for workers in the Society for Religious and Moral Education. And the first prophecy, more than 30 years before the restoration of the Patriarchate in Russia, other students gave Vasily, as they probably thought, a humorous nickname, Patriarch.
Vasily Ivanovich Belavin took for himself as a topic for his candidate's dissertation a very unusual question for us. This question was connected with the phenomenon of Jansenism, which is now rarely heard of. But at the end of the 19th century, the study of Jansenism was very relevant. Because there were very large prerequisites for the reunification of the Old Catholics with the United Russian Orthodox Church, one of the foundations of which was precisely the teaching of Jansenius. Saint Tikhon understood the demands of his time, and the topic of his research at that time was very relevant and promising. He graduated from the St. Petersburg Theological Academy in 1888 with 5th place out of 36 students.
Vasily Belavin was 23 when he graduated from the Theological Academy, and he did not become a monk and did not marry. He returned to the Pskov Seminary as a teacher of theology and French. At the same time, his younger brother, Mikhail, was studying there.
Saint Tikhon took monastic vows at the age of 26 in 1891. He took them in the church of the Pskov seminary. Almost the entire city gathered for this event. Love for the teacher Vasily Ivanovich Belavin was much wider than the walls of the seminary. He was known in the city, and people came to the church on the second floor. They had to prop up the floor from underneath with pillars and logs so that the floor would not collapse because the floors were wooden.
On December 14, 1891, Vasily Belavin received a new name in honor of Saint Tikhon of Zadonsk. Just a week later, he became a hieromonk. The ordination took place in the ancient Holy Trinity Cathedral of the Pskov Kremlin, founded by order of equal to the apostles, Princess Olga.
The fact that Saint Tikhon took holy orders in the Holy Trinity Cathedral and served his first divine services and 40 days prayers is, of course, a special event for us, a milestone in the life that the future patriarch went through. Imbued with that spirit, he visited monasteries which always were treasuries of spiritual wisdom. He had the opportunity to communicate with the elder monks of the 19th century who inhabited the monasteries. Therefore, I think the foundation of the future spiritual life of the patriarch was formed by the period of his service and life in Pskov.
From ancient Pskov, the cradle of Russian civilization, hieromonk Tikhon was transferred to serve in Poland. In March 1892, he became an inspector. In July, a rector of the Orthodox seminary in the town of Chelm. There is a school there now.
There remains a great trace of his stay here as the rector of the Chelm Theological Seminary, then the vicar bishop of the Chelm-Warsaw Diocese, to whom Bishop Ewlogi, the then ruling bishop, entrusted the task of being the dean of the monasteries.
When Archimandrite Tikhon Belavin became Bishop of Lublin, he was 32, and although the future patriarch in Poland was a vicar bishop, his consecration on October 19, 1897 took place in the Holy Trinity Cathedral of the Alexander Nevsky Lavra in the capital of the Russian Empire, and certainly was in no way inferior to the ordination of ruling bishops.
We know that the future Patriarch Tikhon even received special allowance from the Holy Synod for his travel from Lublin to St. Petersburg for his ordination. The emperors paid special attention to the ordained bishops, which was expressed by presenting them with a full set of bishop's vestments and mitre at a meeting of the Synod.
Nowadays, Poland is a predominantly Catholic country. At the end of the 19th century, the places where Saint Tikhon served were sometimes even called Chelm Rus, precisely because Orthodoxy was widespread. This was the heyday of monasticism and the golden age of monasteries. The Virovsky Spassky, Turkovitsky Pokrovsky, and of course, the Lesninsky Mother of God monasteries were founded during the years when Bishop Tikhon of Lublin served as the dean here. It was in Lesno-Podilskaya that the future patriarch met the spiritual father of all Rus, Archpriest John Sergiev from Kronstadt, when he came to study the experience of active monasticism. The founder of the Lesinsky community was Countess Eugenia Yefimovskaya, later Abbess Yekaterina. According to memoirs, the lady was very active and energetic, both at the end of the 19th century and now in Chelm. They do not rule out that it was precisely at her request and thanks to her connections in high society that the very active and energetic vicar was transferred from Poland to a new place of service.
Perhaps Abbess Catherine was the reason that Patriarch Tikhon, then Bishop of Lublin, had to no longer be the dean of the monasteries, but humbly accept the order to move overseas to Alaska and there be an apostle for the Orthodox people living on the American continent.
When Saint Tikhon moved to Moscow a few years later and became first a metropolitan and then a patriarch, he would serve almost every year on December 7th in the church of the great martyr Catherine. At that time, it still had both of its domes and a bell tower.
The current history of the Church of St. Catherine is also connected with the name of Saint Tikhon, the representative church of the Orthodox Church in America to the Patriarch of Moscow and all Rus.
Look down from heaven and behold and visit this point which thy great have planted and established it.
The Orthodox Church in America gained independence from the Moscow Patriarchate in 1970. At the end of the 19th century, it was the Alaska Diocese of the Russian Church, but the bishops ruled from San Francisco. From the time of Saint Innocent, more than half a century passed before Bishop Tikhon arrived on the continent, and not one bishop had visited Alaska, the cradle of Orthodoxy in America. And so, in the summer of 1899, the new bishop made a pilgrimage, on rivers, in boats, on land, on horseback, sometimes on dog sleds or even on foot, almost 7,000 miles in 80 days.
Saint Tikhon's interest in Alaska was both to preserve the integrity of the life there, the unique life that continues to this day of the native people who have embraced the Russian Orthodox faith and have established really a unique indigenous orthodoxy in that land. And that was in many ways an image for what Saint Tikhon hoped to happen throughout the rest of North America.
The Orthodox tradition came to Alaska and California with the merchants of the Russian-American Company. In several decades, a diaspora was formed there that preserved both orthodoxy, here is the vestment of Bishop Tikhon in Holy Trinity Cathedral, and the connection with Russia. Here is a bell donated by Alexander III. And of course, Fort Ross, the capital of Russian America, was preserved then and restored after the earthquake of 1906.
This house is the original house to Fort Ross. However, the roof had been taken off and a second story was added. So for visitors who would come here, there's nowhere else to go. So they would stay in the hotel. And Saint Tikhon stayed here.
Archbishop Tikhon spent only one night and one day in Fort Ross. He served in the Russian cemetery and, of course, in the chapel of St. Nicholas.
This is the first church outside of Alaska, the very, very first Russian Orthodox church. It's important, and why I'm mentioning it, because for Saint Tikhon, it was something important as a pilgrimage. For him to come here, you can't come to California and not come to Fort Ross. It was just, a part of the Orthodox story. So when he came in 1905. He offered a moleben, or a small service in the church.
Historian Robin Joy Wellman converted to Orthodoxy several years ago in Russia, the birthplace of Saint Innocent, and now she is named after him.
Wisdom let us attain.
I believe in one God the Father Almighty.
Reader Ryan Thompson became Orthodox in the early 90s and was baptized in honor of Patriarch Tikhon.
Christ the Son of God.
I was debating if I should take the name of Nicholas after Tsar Nicholas, and something didn't feel right. And I came across a picture of Patriarch Tikhon. And that picture spoke to me. He felt like a grandfather to me. And remember that, grandfather. And so I talked to the priest, and he said, oh, it's an American saint. He lived in America. Learn more about him. So I did. And I decided at baptism, that is the name I would like to take. And the priest conferred that upon me in baptism.
A few years later, Tikhon discovered that the day of the Patriarch's enthronement, November 18th, coincided with his grandfather's birthday.
This is my home chapel. As a reader in the Stets in the church, Sometimes I'll sing services at home alone, or this is where I pray, or do the Jesus prayer and read. But I have a icon of Saint Tikhon. I have part of the prayer rope of Saint Tikhon that was given to me by Bishop Basil of the Antiochian Archdiocese. And then I also have another relic of Saint Tikhon, which I need to put in I need to put it into a kiot and everything at some point when I can. But my Russian is very bad.
It is written here that inside is a particle of the relics of Saint Tikhon. By the way, in America, you can often hear equal to the Apostles Tikhon. After all, it was thanks to him that Orthodoxy was preserved, not only by people from traditionally Orthodox countries, but also accepted by many Uniates, Catholics, and Protestants who emigrated to the New World. New York at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries was, of course, an important trading city. As a port, but as a modern business and cultural center of the United States, it was just emerging. The Orthodox did not even have a church. They first gathered for prayers in the Russian consulate on 2nd Avenue, then rented another hall. By the order of Archbishop Tikhon, a site was found on 97th Street in Manhattan, where St. Nicholas Cathedral of the Patriarchal Parishes in the United States is now. The first donation, 5,000 rubles, came from Emperor Nicholas. The second, 200 rubles, was from John of Kronstadt. Construction began in May 1901, and just a year and a half later, the cathedral was consecrated. In February 1904, the first episcopal consecration in American history took place here. Saint Tikhon ordained Archimandrite Raphael Kavanini a bishop. In September 1905, Archbishop Tikhon moved the see from San Francisco to New York. In the 21st century, a part of 97th Street was renamed in honor of the saint.
Saint Tikhon of Moscow went to very many locations to try to establish a monastery in America. He always had a vision for a monastery in America, but he wanted it to be in the right place. They couldn't find anything that he was satisfied with, so when they came here, they noticed the topography. It was very much like some places in Russia. It had a very unique feel to it that were similar to what he felt would be appropriate for a monastery, the lay of the land, how everything sat. So he decided that when he came here, he said that this is the right place.
The monastery, in honor of the patron saint of the bishop, Saint Tikhon of Zadonsk, was the first Orthodox monastery in America. A local farmer asked $2,000 for the land, and the archbishop donated half of this sum, enormous for 1905.
These are letters from Archbishop Tikhon to Archimandrite Arkady of the Pskov Pechersky Monastery. He expresses gratitude for the money sent to him from the Pskov Pechersky Monastery. These funds will be used to establish a monastery in America. 100 rubles.
I wasn't aware of the donation from Pskov Monastery, but that's a wonderful tie. Knowing that the Russian lands did help to build this monastery because it's a very important place for America, of which the Russian mission that established the church in America, and it really got its foundation and its core, its very center from Russia. So we're deeply indebted to the Russian church for all that has been given to the American mission and to the ongoing care that up until the Russian Revolution was quite vast and far-reaching.
Being far away, he always kept his native seminary and the Pskov Pechersky Monastery and the holy places of Pskov in his heart. I think he wanted to spiritually tie together the Saint Tikhon Monastery, dedicated to Tikhon of Zadonsk, and the Pskov Pechersky Monastery. And perhaps some traditions of Pechori were transferred to the Tikhon of Zadonsk Monastery. But there is another interesting fact. When St. Tikhon was a bishop of the American diocese, in 1900 he transferred 2,500 rubles to the Pskov Theological Seminary with the aim of having them deposited in a bank, and the dividends from this amount was established as a special scholarship.
I would prefer that the scholarship recipient be of clerical rank, an orphan or the son of impoverished parents, distinguished by good morals and not deprived of the scholarship in case of being held back in any grade due to sickness or underdevelopment. This is a letter from Bishop Tikhon from San Francisco.
Christ is the better part, but he's operating through the other. That doesn't mean they're always right, in the sense of
The first Orthodox seminary on the American continent was also founded by Saint Tikhon. There was already a shortage of priests from Russia. Initially, the theological school was in Minnesota, then in New Jersey, and in 1938 it settled in Pennsylvania, across the street from Saint Tikhon's monastery.
Seminarians come from all over America, sometimes from different places in the world. Over the years, we've had seminarians from Russia, Ukraine, Greece, Jerusalem, the more Arabic-speaking countries. We've had a lot of people, and really their witness of Orthodoxy, being able to impart something to them and give them something that is really just a part of this monastery is a great joy to me and a privilege.
The highway that passes through the monastery and seminary is now named after Saint Tikhon, and in March 1907, his path turned back to Russia. He brought home 8 years of experience in serving the church, separate from the state, and not in a monarchy, but a republic.
It certainly indirectly, I'm sure, was, it formed him in many ways, his time here. So perhaps that was one of the elements that made the Holy Synod consider him. But above all, I think it was his humility, his love of Christ, and his calmness.
Bishop Tikhon had a difficult path, connected with service in Poland, preaching orthodoxy among the Uniates, and then in the United States of America, where his missionary and organizational talents were realized. Even then, taking into account the nature of the North American flock, he tried, in the words of the Apostle Paul, to become all things to all people, in order to save at least some.
His Eminence Tikhon has been appointed Archbishop of Yaroslavl and Rostov. This is a copy of the decree from His Imperial Majesty, issued by the Synod to the Yaroslavl Ecclesiastical Consistory. There is a striking quote: "I have heard much good about Yaroslavl and its inhabitants, with their exceptional devotion to the Church of God, to the faith, and to the splendor of holy temples, being especially noted. Something I have now witnessed with my own eyes." These were his first words to the people of Yaroslavl.
Saint Tikhon arrived in April 1907. Difficult years. The revolution had passed, and there was such an attitude towards the church, robberies of churches, a bad attitude towards the rural clergy. But Saint Tikhon, from the beginning, made a very favorable impression on the clergy, on the laity, on the authorities. From the very first words, he invited them to love the church, to keep the faith. And by his example, he showed how to serve the church and the fatherland.
At the time he arrived in his new diocese, Archbishop Tikhon of Yaroslavl and Rostov was 42. And he was a knight of the Order of St. Anne in the 2nd and 1st degrees, and held the 3rd degree of the Order of St. Vladimir. From the very first days, the bishop began to get actively acquainted with the diocese. He built a system of charitable societies to help the sick, homeless, and poor people. He performed divine services. He could visit 5 churches in different villages during the day and spend the night in some monastery, and he prayed everywhere. He also tried to understand all the problems of parishioners, priests, and monks. He was always surrounded by people. This photo is from 1913, after the consecration of St. Nicholas Church in the village of Gorylova. The church was dismantled for bricks in 1962, but the railway bridge across the Volga, on which St. Tikhon was first filmed, and which the future patriarch consecrated the year of the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty, survived the Soviet time and is still in use.
Archbishop Tikhon certainly saw these very sights. He lived in the 17th century abbot's quarters. There are accounts recalling how, in the evenings, he would leave his residence, pass through the 16th century church of the Holy Cross, and come here. But why specifically to this 19th century church? Because it housed a grand silver reliquary containing the relics of Yaroslav's most revered saints, Fyodor, David, and Constantine.
Patriarch Tikhon was a unique person. He was very kind. He donated so much of his personal bishop's money into various charitable institutions.
In the petition to build one more hotel in the Tolga Monastery, there are edits by Archbishop Tikhon. For example, it says, "A hotel for visiting pilgrims at the monastery." This is underlined by Archbishop Tikhon and signed, but by no means for summer residents. A noble hotel with its comfortable arrangement is also underlined. And you see that there is a question mark and an exclamation mark. So what does it mean? The very same cedar trees that once witnessed his presence still stand here today. Many of the park cedars are now between 197 and 235 years old. His Eminence would seek solitude in one of the towers of our cedar park, that he found respite from the inevitable bustle that came with his sacred duties.
The presentation of the Virgin Mary Monastery is just a few miles from Yaroslavl. Although Archbishop Tikhon didn't stay in the region for the 600th anniversary of the appearance of the Tolga icon of the Mother of God here and of the founding of the monastery, he managed to organize a huge restoration for the anniversaries and established a school where boys were taught not only the usual sciences, but also agricultural skills. No doubt the most striking event for Bishop Tikhon, as for all Russia at that time, was the celebration of the 300th anniversary of the imperial dynasty.
During the tercentenary celebrations of the Romanov dynasty, Archbishop Tikhon greeted the imperial family at the entrance of the Dormition Cathedral in Yaroslavl. He then provided the emperor with an excursion at the Savior Monastery, which had served as the residence of Tsar Mikhail Fyodorovich in 1613.
He said such wonderful words that 300 years ago, Yaroslavl played a major role in the liberation of Russia from the Polish-Lithuanian conquest. And the young Tsar, Mikhail Romanov, lived in the Spassky Monastery for 26 days. All of Yaroslavl then met and saw off the young Mikhail Romanov with tears. "So we now," the saint said to the emperor, "meet you with tears, sovereign, and wish you that our fatherland will prosper under your rule."
Tsar Nicholas II, with his family, accompanied by the Archbishop, visited Yaroslavl, Rostov the Great, and the Tolga Monastery.
Here, the future patriarch welcomed the royal family. In 1913, the imperial family traveled by the Volga River and arrived aboard the steamship Mizhin and docked at our monastery's pier. A service was conducted by the bishop himself. After the service, they took a peaceful stroll through the cedar grove.
A month later, Archbishop Tikhon was awarded the Alexander Nevsky Order, and in January 1914, the Synod transferred him to Lithuania.
He accepted this transfer with gratitude. He said that on his birthday, when his 50th year was beginning, although he always wanted to go to Central Russia, he had to go to the West. And we know that he also played a very important role there in those difficult years.
After Bishop Tikhon's departure, in January 1914, the Yaroslavl City Council declared him an honorary citizen. It was unprecedented, and it took the Synod several months to bless the Archbishop of Vilnius in Lithuania to accept this title.
A telegram of gratitude by Archbishop Tikhon to the mayor of Yaroslavl reads, "I extend my sincere and profound gratitude to you and to the honorable members of the City Council. I am comforted that even after my departure from Yaroslavl, I have not become a stranger to this glorious ancient city. May God's blessings abide upon it. May it abound in piety and earthly prosperity. I wish many years of good life to all who labor for its welfare. Archbishop Tikhon.
Это икона Матери Божьей Белынической.
This is the icon of the Mother of God of Belinichi, presented to this church by Tsar Nicholas II himself. And, incidentally, the church also received the icon of Alexander Nevsky in its magnificent frame, a piece of great significance for the military, directly from the hands of Nicholas II as well.
Николая II.
Ancient icons have miraculously survived in Holy Trinity Church in the town of Knyaginin in Belarus. Here, in peacetime, the emperor traveled by the railway from St. Petersburg to his manor to hunt. When World War I began, the frontline town became a hospital.
The events of the First World War had a very painful impact on the territory of Belarus, and it was not easy for the ruling bishop. During his service here on Belarusian lands, Saint Tikhon lovingly visited both military groups and parishes. It made no difference to him whether the settlement was large or small. He went where he was expected. Apparently, the missionary experience of the saint's service in America had an effect, and most of all, his heart was filled with love for his neighbors.
I should explain. The Vilnius diocese, when it was ruled by Saint Tikhon, covered a huge area, not only of present Lithuania, but also of the northern part of present-day Belarus. The town of Glubokaya, for example, is in the region of Vitebsk.
In our church, in the tabernacle, there is a sacred relic, an antimens signed by Patriarch Tikhon when he was Archbishop of Vilna and Lithuania. He visited our cathedral and served divine liturgy on this antimens. On the reverse side is the signature of His Holiness the Patriarch, in which is written, "Humble Tikhon, Archbishop of Lithuania and Vilna." We keep this antimens and use it for worship only in special solemn services. And we always remember His Holiness the Patriarch, who blessed our church with his presence.
In 1915, German troops were approaching Vilna, nowadays Vilnius. Archbishop Tikhon decided to evacuate the main shrine of the Lithuanian Church, the holy relics of the Vilna martyrs, Anthony, John, and Eustathius. For several years, they were, let us note, in the Donskoy Monastery in Moscow. At that time, the Vilna See was moved to the ancient town of Disna.
When the Patriarch had already ascended the throne to the Moscow Cathedral, our people, the parishioners of Disna, wrote a letter of gratitude to Patriarch Tikhon, and the Patriarch sent this letter, which is in this church. And there is an icon of Patriarch Tikhon, and there is his reliquary. It was brought from the monastery. A relic was taken from Moscow and brought here. And so Patriarch Tikhon is here now.
Eventually, the Germans occupied Disna, but while the front line passed through the territory of his diocese, Saint Tikhon continued to visit both the trenches and hospitals. And in September 1916, he visited the parishes free from occupation for the last time. In Knyaginin, the Archbishop served a memorial service for the soldiers of the Russian army who forced the Germans to transfer reserves from the Western Front and stop their offensive in France. The bishop served the liturgy in the wooden Holy Trinity Church constructed in the middle of the 18th century.
Here we see the Vladimir icon of the Mother of God, which was brought to this church during this period by soldiers departing for the front. It is quite possible that during his visit on September 10, 1916, Archbishop Tikhon venerated this very icon, and his blessing instilled in people's hearts the faith that life would return to these lands and that everything would eventually be restored. This marked his final visit to this place. He subsequently traveled to Vileyka region, to Dolginovo and Rechki, places equally ravaged by this terrible war, where he prayed for those who had sacrificed their lives.
Evacuated to Moscow, Archbishop Tikhon met here the Russian Revolution and the fall of the monarchy. In May 1917, he was elected a bishop of the Moscow diocese, and in August, he was elevated to the rank of metropolitan. It was as the host that he welcomed the delegates of the First Council of the Russian Church in 2.5 centuries, where, after heated debate, the Patriarchate was restored.
The restoration of the Patriarchate at the beginning of the 20th century coincided with a severe crisis in our country. In the conditions of the Civil War and devastation, hatred and hostility, the collapse of former foundations, and the loss of moral guidelines, the urgent need for a unifying force for the appearance of a spiritual leader who could become an authority not only for believers, but also unite the disunited layers of society around himself was especially acute. By God's providence, such a lot fell to Saint Tikhon. This is a list of members of the local council, proposed by notes and then crossed out for the position and written in for the patriarchs. That moment the Patriarchate was not yet envisaged when this form was printed, but the person who kept it, he crossed out the word position because the Patriarch is not a position.
The election of candidates for the patriarchal throne was held in 2 rounds. The first determined a general list of 25 candidates, and then 3 candidates were chosen from them by separate voting for each. Archbishop Anthony of Kharkov received 159 votes, Archbishop Arseny of Novgorod 148, and Metropolitan Tikhon of Moscow 125.
From that moment on, Metropolitan Tikhon of Moscow became a candidate for the patriarchal throne, one of 3, the one who received the fewest votes. But from that moment he was on his direct path to his Golgotha. When it was the patriarchal election, and you know he was chosen by lot, there were 3 candidates. One of them was called the strictest bishop of our church. The second one, the smartest bishop. He was a very profound theologian. And the future Patriarch Tikhon was called the kindest. Here is kindness, mercy, meekness. Such qualities with humility together are such for a person that lead him directly into eternal life, opening a direct path to the kingdom of heaven.
The council chamber got its name precisely because the Russian Church Council made historic decisions here in 1917 through 18. At that time, it was the Moscow Diocese office. Now it is the main building of Saint Tikhon's Orthodox University of the Humanities.
Only working sessions of the local council were held in the house of the diocese, but for prayer services the delegates gathered in Moscow churches. And by the way, the final election of the Patriarch also took place in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior.
On November 18, 1917, the delegates of the local council went to liturgy. After that, in front of the ancient Vladimir icon of the Mother of God, Schema Archimandrite Alexei from the Zosima Hermitage drew a slip of paper from a chest with the name of the first patriarch in the modern history of the Russian Church.
This is the very lot that the elder monk Alexei Solyov drew, which he handed over to Metropolitan Vladimir Bogoyovlinsky, and the contents of which were announced: Tikhon, Metropolitan of Moscow, and Kolomna.
The lots for the other 2 candidates were also announced, so that the delegates would have no doubts. Bishop Arseny would die in exile in Central Asia in 1936, in the arms of his spiritual child, the future Saint Luke of Crimea. Bishop Anthony would outlive him by only 6 months, and would pass away in Yugoslavia as the first hierarch of the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. proclaimed after the death of Patriarch Tikhon.
None of the three final candidates were present at the announcement of the lot. Each one preferred to spend that time in solitude. Saint Tikhon, for example, prayed in his diocese residence, which was then at the Holy Trinity Lavra.
Your news of my election as Patriarch, Saint Tikhon addressed the delegates of the local council, is the scroll on which is written weeping and groaning and woe. How many tears and groans will I have to swallow in my upcoming patriarchal service, and especially in these difficult times? These first words of his after his election as Patriarch turned out to be prophetic.
An epistle from humble Tikhon, by God's mercy, Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia, to the beloved in the Lord archpastors, pastors, and all faithful children of the Russian Orthodox Church.
In his address of January 19, 1918, Patriarch Tikhon anathematized everyone who were overt and covert enemies and had persecuted the truth of Christ and sought to destroy the work of Christ, and instead of Christian love, sowed everywhere the seeds of malice, hatred, and fratricidal strife.
Our archives contain the complete case file of Archpriest Sergei Afanasyevich Protopopov from the Revolutionary Provincial Tribunal of Kaluga. He served as the dean of the Kozelsk district. The charges against him involved counter-revolutionary activity, specifically that on Sunday, January 28, 1918, without authorization from Soviet authorities, Archpriest Protopopov deliberately read aloud Patriarch Tikhon's epistle from the newspaper, the early morning. For this act, the priest was arrested and sentenced to 1 year of imprisonment. However, in 2003, he was fully rehabilitated with the official determination that the act was found to pose no threat to society.
The Patriarch resolutely condemned the murder of Archpriest Peter Skipetrov in Petrograd, Metropolitan Vladimir in Kiev, and sharply criticized the Brest peace with Germany. And the Bolsheviks seemed not to pay attention to this. In May 1918, they did not even interfere with the religious procession on Red Square on St. Nicholas Day and against the desecration of holy places. So many people gathered that tram traffic in the center of Moscow stopped. A few weeks later, the Patriarch was summoned to a revolutionary tribunal, but he went to Petrograd.
Of course, it was a historic event when the Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia visited the capital that was founded in the years when we had no patriarchs. And according to contemporaries, it was a church-wide celebration. Crowds greeted Saint Tikhon everywhere, both clergy and laity. Speeches were made on the most daring topics, expecting a response from the primate. It is known, for example, that one of the archpriests, representing the Union of Orthodox Brotherhoods, addressed Saint Tikhon with the words that we are all ready to die in the name of Christ for the good of our church. And Saint Tikhon, with his characteristic humor, responded that it is not surprising to die now. Let us learn to live.
When the newspapers reported the execution of Tsar Nicholas, the Patriarch blessed the service of requiems in churches. This obviously irritated the Bolsheviks. At the same time, his personal freedom was not limited yet, and the primate managed to visit the Yaroslavl diocese and Ivanovo-Voznesensk.
It was August 1918. His Holiness Patriarch Tikhon celebrated the all-night vigil in our church on the 25th. And on the 26th, the liturgy for the name's day, the feast of Saint Tikhon of Zadonsk. The faithful desperately needed spiritual strength, as the church was already facing persecution after the revolution, which had begun in Ivanovo. Someone from the city brought us a historic photograph showing their relatives seated with Patriarch Tikhon. It is deeply moving, of course. This photograph is now kept in the monastery's museum.
This picture is from the town of Danilov in the province of Yaroslavl. In September 1918, when the Bolsheviks stopped the work of the local council of the Russian Church, Patriarch Tikhon consecrated the Cathedral of the Mother of God convent on Garushka.
Saint Tikhon, knowing that John of Kronstadt blessed the construction of the large cathedral in the city of Danilov, and Saint Tikhon had repeatedly visited Danilov, this monastery, and elevated the nun Maria to the rank of abbess, and knew the difficulties with which the construction of this cathedral was taking place, he did not refuse to consecrate this beautiful cathedral.
Of course, this was a miracle. Everywhere else, churches were being shut down. Take, for example, Moscow's New Savior Monastery. They killed the monks. At the very same time, here in Danilov, a miracle unfolded, the consecration of our cathedral.
Returning from Danilov to Moscow, the Patriarch visited his beloved Yaroslavl. Not long before, there had been an anti-Soviet uprising. The Bolsheviks suppressed it by shelling the city with artillery. The number of victims of the civil war and terror on all sides of the conflict was already in the tens of thousands. The Primate issued his famous appeal, "Come to your senses, madmen," begging a stop to the bloody reprisals, but in vain. Being an obvious opponent of the Bolsheviks, he did not bless the monarchists either. The church, as he believed, could not be red or white. When famine began in the country, he called on parishioners to help those in need, but the authorities continued to smash churches and confiscate everything that could be sold or melted down, even liturgical utensils. The Patriarch called this sacrilege.
This is the investigative case of Patriarch Tikhon. The Supreme Revolutionary Tribunal opened this case because Patriarch Tikhon was a counter-revolutionary. And here is the verdict of the People's Court of the city of Moscow. It is written as a political appeal. Symbolic figures have passed before the court. Abbess Seraphima, Hieromonk Dosifei, the dark, illiterate, superstitious witness Volkova, the head of the Russian Church, the wise, experienced, hypocritically cunning monk, hereinafter in quotation marks, Patriarch Tikhon, proposed to the People's Commissariat of Justice to investigate the activities of hereinafter in quotation marks, Patriarch Tikhon.
In May 1922, a blow came from the clergy. On the initiative of the anti-church administration, the Living Church movement and the so-called Supreme Church Administration were created. The Renovationist schism began.
It was a false church that was created by the state authorities to replace the real church, to replace the canonical hierarchy, and then to destroy it with the hands of the clerics themselves. But neither our hierarchy nor Patriarch Tikhon, although he was under enormous pressure from the authorities, recognized the Renovationists and did not unite with them.
The Renovationists seized many churches in Moscow, including the Metochion of the Saint Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius. The Primate was forced to move to Donskoy Monastery, first under an obligation not to leave the city, and soon under house arrest.
In the huge Donskoy monastery, Patriarch Tikhon was isolated in this small house. Even walks were allowed only on the terrace around the gate church of the Tikhvin icon of the Mother of God.
Soviet newspapers reported that the Patriarch would be tried on charges of counter-revolutionary activity. It was even reported that it would take place in the columned hall in the center of Moscow.
The Patriarch was transferred from here to Lubyanka. He spent 40 days in solitary confinement in very difficult conditions. But anti-Bolshevik sentiments increased. Dzerzhinsky reported this to the Politburo, international pressure played some role, and it became clear that the Patriarch had to be released.
On June 8, 1923, Saint Tikhon returned to the Donskoy Monastery. A delegation of Renovationists immediately came to him, demanding that he renounce not only the Patriarchate, but even monasticism. The schismatics left empty-handed, and the Patriarch was treated for the consequences of his imprisonment until the end of June. The criminal prosecution was dropped only in March 1924, and the trial never took place.
Taking into account that citizen Belavin V.I., and Belavin is written with one L, former Patriarch Tikhon publicly repented of his counter-revolutionary speeches against the power of workers and peasants. The Presidium of the Central Executive Committee of the USSR decided to terminate the case against Belavin V.I. in the crimes provided for by certain articles of the Code of the Soviet Russia. Bearing responsibility for the Church, the Patriarch made wise decisions. In some matters of no fundamental importance, he was ready to make a certain compromise with the secular authorities, called for no revenge on persecutors, and prayed for reconciliation between the warring parties. All this made it possible to preserve church life as best he could. Patriarch Tikhon, who became the helmsman of the Church at a time when its very existence was under threat, managed to walk the Tsar path. Undoubtedly, the Lord himself, the founder and head of the Church, helped him walk this path fearlessly and without stumbling, supporting the Primate and guiding him to the truth.
On June 28, 1923, the Patriarch held his first prayer service in more than a year. It was a memorial service for Archpriest Alexei Michov at the St. Lazarus Cemetery. The footage shows how many believers prayed together with their primate. On July 1st, up to 10,000 believers came to the liturgy at the Donskoy Monastery. It was already obvious to many people that the renovationist schism was doomed.
The name of the Patriarch was announced before the Vladimir icon of the Mother of God, and at the church of the meeting of the Vladimir icon of the Mother of God. There is one more reason. One of the visits of the Primate became fateful for the entire Russian Church.
It was July 6, 1923, the feast of the Vladimir icon. The day before, the abbot of the Sretinsky Monastery, Bishop Hilarion, who had just returned from exile, reconsecrated the ancient church, previously desecrated by the renovationists. In the morning, after a liturgy served by the Patriarch, many of the schismatics began to repent in public.
As soon as it became clear that the Patriarch was here, many sincerely repented and returned to the Church, and it all began right here. And then a series of similar returns to the Church went on throughout Moscow and throughout the Russian Church. Therefore, we can say that the divine service here on July 6, 1923, was the beginning of the repentance.
Threats to destroy the Russian Church came in the 1920s not only from the Bolsheviks and renovationists. The new states established after the First World War on the former territory of the Russian Empire, to put it mildly, also didn't welcome orthodoxy. The Patriarch could support his flock, which suddenly found itself abroad, only with prayer.
When he was in prison behind his back, taking advantage of the impossibility of influencing these processes, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, contrary to all canons and church rules, granted autocephaly to the Polish Orthodox Church. This was a completely wrong action. However, we can see that history is repeating itself in our time. And this act was signed, but it wasn't proclaimed during the life of Saint Tikhon. His authority did not allow this unlawful document to be made public. Only 6 months after the earthly life of the saint ended, in September 1925, this document was published.
In the Museum of the Monastery of Tikhon of Zadonsk in Pennsylvania, you can see the Panagia and mantle of Saint Tikhon of Moscow when he was still a metropolitan. He gave them to the American delegates at the Church Council who were returning from Moscow to the USA. After the Russian Revolution, the Alaska Diocese, although it had no connection with Moscow, remained in the Moscow Patriarchate during the life of Saint Tikhon in memory of his service in America.
As you know, the situation in North America was very complicated at that time, so there was many opportunities for people to choose where they would like to go, and much confusion, but the influence and the memory of Saint Tikhon, the impact that he had on the church here remained in many ways, and certainly was very influential in people's decisions to leave the church, to go to other jurisdictions or not.
In December 1924, in Donskoy Monastery, Patriarch Tikhon witnessed the murder of his cell attendant, Yakov Polosov, who had been with the saint since 1902. This was another blow to his kind but already seriously sick heart. In January 1925, shortly before his 60th birthday, the primate went to the Bakunin's hospital in Moscow, where he did not get worse for a time.
On April 5th, the team of doctors, unknown to him, came to him to remove the roots of the teeth that were bothering him. Father Alexander Tolsky, a well-known Moscow archpriest, heard confession from a nurse who gave Patriarch Tikhon a double dose of a powerful drug that was then used for anesthesia, morphine, to provoke a heart attack, which ultimately led to the death of His Holiness the Patriarch.
Patriarch Tikhon's heart stopped beating on the Feast of the Annunciation, and his funeral on April 12th in Donskoy Monastery coincided with Palm Sunday. His close priests and bishops kept the burial place such a strict secret that after his canonization on October 9, 1989, it took more than 2 years of research in the archives, conversations with old priests and parishioners, and archaeological searches to find the crypt. It happened late in the evening of February 22, 1992. On this occasion, the still small brethren of the revived Donskoy Monastery woke Moscow with the ringing of bells.
His Holiness Alexei arrived. Everyone was standing over the coffin. The Patriarch said to me, "Listen, Father Tikhon, climb in there and take a look. Lift the lid." I put on the epitracheon, cuffs, and not quite understanding what awaited us, I stretched out my hand and felt a human hand in a sleeve. And I shouted in a voice that was not my own, "Here, here!" The Patriarch also shouted, which was completely unusual for him, "Get out, get out, get out!" And then we decided to open the lid with the blessing of the Patriarch and saw the body of Saint Tikhon in those very vestments, and next to it, very touchingly, a willow branch. A great event, because the discovery of relics is always a holiday. It is always joy. And here, when almost everyone was sure that there were no relics, their discovery in this difficult time for Rus, for our people, I think this is a manifestation of God's mercy, that the Lord, through the prayers of Saint Tikhon, will not abandon us, will strengthen and support us.
In the fall of 1992, Patriarch Alexei II visited the monastery in Pennsylvania founded by his predecessor, and the abbot had a cross given to him by one of his companions as a memory. In Moscow and elsewhere, miracles began to happen in the meantime. One of them was recently shown by an X-ray fluorescent analyzer and a microbiological test of the gospel that was buried with Patriarch Tikhon. The paper, which had been deteriorating for several decades due to natural causes, completely stopped decaying approximately from the moment of the saint's canonization.
This is the only known case in science. For the first time, it was observed that neither spores nor any traces remained. There is no clear evidence of decomposition, yet no evidence of how it occurred. In other words, the moment of canonization radically altered the behavior of natural, scientifically established forces.
Those are a mitre, a gospel from the burial, and the saint's kukol.
In the Museum of Donskoy Monastery, we can see the Patriarch's kukol, well known from numerous photos of Saint Tikhon. Also, here are the panagias which he was buried with, the rosary, the crucifix, the liturgical vestments, and the hand-embroidered velvet mantle that was presented to the primate on January 21, 1918.
The most fervent offering of the Alexievsky Monastery.
Rejoice, O humble Tikhon.
Tikhon from San Francisco also visited the Donskoy Monastery, but in 1995, before the museum was established.
The only thing I had read in English said that his relics were in the small cathedral. So I traveled thousands of miles, almost 12 time zones, and the doors were locked. And I didn't speak, my Russian is still very shaky, and I decided to go into the main cathedral. And I was overjoyed to see that the relics had been transferred to the main cathedral.
After the canonization of Saint Tikhon, churches began to be built dedicated to him. Some were small, but in Yaroslavl, where the Patriarch spent the longest time, a huge cathedral is being built. It's not completed yet, but there is already a special icon of the saint. The Patriarch is not wearing his kukol as usual, but a mitre, as during the Divine Liturgy.
A lot of people come to the church. Our church is located in a residential area, and here are a lot of parishioners. I am glad that a lot of little parishioners are named after Saint Tikhon. That is, you give communion to a baby, and he is Tikhon. Well, it is clear that we already understand that this is connected specifically with our Saint Tikhon. In this way, the memory of the saint lives in the people and is passed on to children and grandchildren.
The Kazan Icon Church in Danilov, the only one that Patriarch Tikhon consecrated in his capacity as a primate, after decades of desolation, began a new history with the name of the saint.
His Eminence Mihai, Archbishop of Yaroslavl and Rostov, blessed the construction of a side chapel here in honor of Patriarch Tikhon. The church is currently undergoing restoration and revival. While renovation work continues in the main cathedral, services are being held in the site of the chapel.
This new church dedicated to Patriarch Tikhon is in Shalchininkai, Lithuania, where he was also the ruling bishop. In Toropets, which Patriarch Tikhon considered his homeland, a heartwarming monument was installed. The saint seems to have sat down to rest in the garden of the Belavins family house. Inside one is a museum that immerses you in the atmosphere of the 19th century.
He was unmercenary, absolutely unmercenary. When he came to a new diocese, he used what was in the diocese, and he used those vestments. Therefore, what remained in the town of Toropets and the house museum, nothing remained. These walls remained, which remember the life story of this saint. And when a person immerses himself in this environment of the 19th century, interest in the life of Patriarch Tikhon increases. It is simply impossible not to love Patriarch Tikhon, because he was open to everyone. Saint Tikhon unites both the people of Belarus and Russia, and at the same time reminds those Orthodox people who live in America that his pastoral love embraced everyone, including Poland. He lived on these lands, he knew these people. This connection inspires people and helps them to realize the integrity of the Russian Orthodox Church, the need to preserve the unity for which Saint Tikhon stood so zealously.
These stories are so important in Russia, they're important in the United States, they're important for our Orthodoxy faith and who we are and our ancestors. We often think about all of the saints as being so long ago. But the saints that were here are recent, within the last 200 years. And I think it should be remembered because they're today, it's now.
At the end of his life, he said, before he died, "Let my name perish, that the church may live." And we see that indeed the church lives in Russia and survived much persecution and very difficult times, but also his name as well. His name did not perish.
Note that the head of the Orthodox Church in America received his monastic name after Patriarch Tikhon.
Often in the monastic life, the names for the new monks are given with the first letter of their old name. My birth name was Mark with an M, so I was expecting a name with an M, but I was very pleasantly surprised to hear the name Tikhon. I felt very humbled to bear this name, and I still do to this day. It reminds me always of, my high calling as now the Metropolitan and Primate of the Orthodox Church in America, but reminds me in that service that I I remain and should strive to remain a humble monk, which Saint Tikhon was in many ways throughout his life, even as he became the patriarch.
For me, this was truly a ray of light. Why? Because we took our monastic vows in St. Nicholas Church. There's a fresco of Patriarch Tikhon. My cell happened to be right behind the wall where this fresco was located. The moment the bishop pronounced that name, I looked up and saw the saint's gaze seemingly resting upon me. And you realize you've gained what I can only describe as another kind of relative, someone you can turn to, who may have already been guiding your life in ways you didn't yet know. These are the moments that sink deep into your soul and stay with you.
And over the years, I realized that Saint Tikhon was appropriate. Many things in my life have happened because of his intercessions. People ask me, what is this? And so I tell them, it's my patron saint. And so it's a good way of introducing orthodoxy to others.
First of all, he is a loved one. A loved one. And the more you learn about him, the closer he becomes. In general, to feel that such a person is somehow involved in my life, and his answer is also important to me, and to some extent obvious from the continuous interest in the personality of Patriarch Tikhon, which is based only on internal, sincere closeness and love. How he is there, I do not know. I can say about myself.
Considering how much the first patriarch of the Russian Church in modern history did, experienced, and endured in his life, everyone can prayerfully ask any request of him, and believers go to see their saint. There are no days in Donskoy Monastery when it is deserted.
Well, now you can go to the great cathedral of the Donskoy Monastery and venerate the holy relics of Patriarch Tikhon. Patriarch Tikhon indeed became a confessor, and perhaps even a martyr. But precisely because he remained faithful to his bishop's oath, faithful to the Church of God, to the end, he became the one who, during the long decades of atheistic rule in our country, remained our spiritual beacon, our teacher. He did his utmost to preserve the unity of the Church, and he achieved this. Through the prayers of Saint Tikhon, Patriarch of all Russia, may the Lord protect us, everyone.
Аминь.
Патриарха Тихона восхвалим, и к нему с верою и упованием возопьем. Предстательством святительским ко Господу, церковь русскую в тишине соблюди. Расточенное чадо Иява, едино стадо собери, поступившие от правые веры к покаянию обрати. Страну нашу от междоусобные брани сохрани, и мир Божий людям испроси. Слава Отцу и Сыну и Святому Духу, и ныне и присно, и во веки веков. Аминь. Тихостью нрава украшен, кротость и милосердие кающимся являй. Во исповедании православные веры и любви ко Господу, твердыне преклонен прибыл еси, святителю Христов Тихоне. Молися о нас, да не разлучимся от любви Божия, я же о Христе Иисусе Господе наш.